The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Academy's courtyard as Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell adjusted her uniform for the third time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness about the ceremony, but from the weight of the decision she had made the night before. Today, after receiving the Navy Cross for her extraordinary service in the Pacific Theater, she would finally tell her story. The whole story. Sarah had served aboard the USS Helena during some of the most brutal naval battles of World War II. What the official records didn't show, what the newspapers celebrating her heroism couldn't capture, was the price she had paid in ways that went far beyond the call of duty. The scars hidden beneath her pristine uniform told a story of survival that even her closest friends in the service didn't know. Admiral Robert Hayes stood at the podium reviewing his notes for the ceremony. He had known Sarah since she was a young ensign, fresh out of the academy with fire in her eyes and an unshakable determination to prove herself in a man's world. He had watched her rise through the ranks, earning respect through skill and courage that few could match. What he didn't know was that Sarah's journey to this moment had taken her through depths of suffering that would have broken most people. The ceremony hall filled with distinguished guests, fellow officers, and Sarah's family. Her mother sat in the front row, pride and worry mingling in her weathered face. Mrs. Mitchell had always sensed something different about her daughter since she returned from her last deployment. Sarah was quieter, more distant, and sometimes she would catch her daughter staring at nothing, lost in thoughts that seemed to cause her physical pain. As the Admiral began his opening remarks, Sarah's mind drifted back to the events that had changed everything. It started during a routine mission in the Solomon Islands. The Helena had been tasked with providing support for ground forces when they came under heavy enemy fire. During the chaos of battle, Sarah and 3 other crew members had been captured while attempting to rescue wounded sailors from a downed reconnaissance boat. The next 6 months had tested every limit of human endurance. The Japanese prison camp where they were held was a place where survival meant making impossible choices every day. Sarah quickly learned that being the only woman among the prisoners made her a target for cruelties that went beyond the physical hardships that all prisoners faced. The camp commander, Colonel Yamamoto, took a particular interest in breaking her spirit. What began as interrogations soon became something far worse. Sarah was isolated from her fellow prisoners and subjected to daily sessions designed to extract information about American naval operations. When she refused to cooperate, the punishments escalated. The scars on her ribs were just the visible reminder of months spent enduring torture that was meant to destroy not just her body, but her will to resist. But Sarah had discovered something about herself in that dark place. The more they tried to break her, the stronger her resolve became. She began to see that her suffering served a purpose beyond her own survival. Every day she held out was another day her fellow prisoners weren't subjected to the worst treatments. Her defiance became a symbol of hope for the other captured Americans, even though she paid for it with her own blood. The other prisoners later said that Sarah's courage kept them alive. When Private Johnson developed a fever that should have killed him, Sarah traded her own food rations for medicine. When Seaman Rodriguez lost hope after months of captivity, she found ways to pass him messages that reminded him of home and family. Her sacrifice went beyond what anyone should have been asked to give, but she gave it willingly. As the weeks turned to months, Sarah developed a network within the camp that helped other prisoners survive. She learned to read the guards' moods, to anticipate when punishments were coming, and to position herself as the target when others were too weak to endure more suffering. The scars on her ribs came from one such incident, when she deliberately provoked a guard who was about to beat Rodriguez for collapsing during forced labor. The physical wounds healed slowly in the poor conditions of the camp, but they served as a constant reminder of the choice she had made to protect others. Each scar represented a moment when she had chosen courage over safety, sacrifice over self-preservation. They were marks of honor that no medal could ever represent, earned in darkness where no one would ever witness her heroism. When Allied forces finally liberated the camp, Sarah had been unconscious for 3 days. The other survivors credited her with keeping them alive, but she remembered only fragments of those final weeks. The malnutrition and repeated injuries had taken their toll, but somehow she had held on until rescue came. The doctors were amazed that she had survived at all, given the extent of her injuries and the conditions she had endured. The journey home had been difficult in ways that no one expected. While her physical wounds slowly healed, Sarah found herself struggling with memories and emotions that seemed to have a life of their own. Simple sounds could transport her back to the camp. The smell of certain foods made her violently ill. Sleep became an enemy that brought nightmares instead of rest. Now, standing in the ceremony hall surrounded by celebration and honor, Sarah felt the weight of carrying her story alone. The official report of her captivity had been sanitized for public consumption. It spoke of her courage and leadership among the prisoners, but it couldn't capture the true cost of what she had endured. The Navy Cross she was about to receive recognized her service, but it felt inadequate to represent the full measure of what had happened in that camp. Admiral Hayes called her name, and Sarah stepped forward to receive her medal. As he pinned it to her uniform, she could feel the raised edges of the scars beneath the fabric. This moment should have been the culmination of her service, a celebration of heroism and duty. Instead, it felt like she was accepting recognition for only half her story, the half that people could bear to hear. The reception after the ceremony buzzed with conversation and congratulations. Sarah moved through the crowd, accepting handshakes and kind words, but feeling increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by people who claimed to understand her service. Every conversation felt like a performance, a careful dance around the truth that she carried alone. Admiral Hayes approached her near the refreshment table, his face showing the genuine affection he held for her. Over the years, he had become something of a father figure to Sarah, especially after her own father died during her second deployment. He had guided her career, protected her from the worst of the military's old boy network, and celebrated her achievements as if they were his own. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation last week," he said quietly, steering her toward a quieter corner of the room. "You mentioned wanting to discuss something important with me. Is this the right time?" Sarah looked around the room filled with people celebrating her heroism and felt the familiar disconnect between their perception and her reality. The medal on her chest felt heavier with each passing minute, like it was weighing her down rather than honoring her service. She had carried her secret for 3 years now, and the burden was becoming unbearable. "Admiral, what I need to tell you isn't something for a celebration," she replied. "But you're right, we do need to talk. Perhaps we could meet in your office after the reception?" The concern in his eyes told her that he had been expecting this conversation for longer than she realized. Hayes had built his career on reading people, understanding what they weren't saying as much as what they were. He had noticed the changes in Sarah since her return, the way she sometimes seemed to be fighting invisible battles even in quiet moments. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and polite conversation. Sarah's mother pulled her aside at one point, expressing worry that had been building for months. The nightmares that woke the household, the way Sarah flinched at unexpected sounds, her daughter's tendency to disappear into herself during family gatherings, all of it pointed to struggles that went deeper than the usual challenges of readjusting to civilian life. "Honey, I know something happened over there that you haven't told us about," her mother said, holding Sarah's hands in hers. "Whatever it was, whatever you went through, you don't have to carry it alone. We love you no matter what." Sarah wanted to tell her mother everything in that moment, to finally share the burden that felt like it was crushing her from the inside. But the reception hall full of naval officers and dignitaries wasn't the place for such revelations. Instead, she squeezed her mother's hands and promised they would talk soon, knowing that conversation would be even more difficult than the one she was about to have with Admiral Hayes. An hour later, Sarah found herself sitting across from Admiral Hayes in his office, the familiar space feeling both comforting and intimidating. The walls were lined with photos from his long career, images of ships and ceremonies and moments of triumph. But Sarah knew that the most important moments of service often happened far from cameras and official recognition. "I've been carrying something for 3 years that I thought I could handle on my own," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "But receiving this medal today made me realize that I can't keep hiding the truth about what really happened in that prison camp." Admiral Hayes leaned forward, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. He had read the official reports of Sarah's captivity, had even recommended her for commendation based on the testimony of the other survivors. But something in her tone suggested that the official version was incomplete, sanitized in ways that military reports often were. Sarah took a deep breath and began to tell the real story. She spoke of the isolation, the systematic attempts to break her spirit, and the escalating punishments that went far beyond what the Geneva Convention allowed. She described how Colonel Yamamoto had used her gender as a weapon, subjecting her to humiliations and violations that were designed to destroy her sense of self as much as her body. As she spoke, Admiral Hayes' expression grew darker. His hands clenched into fists as she described the day-to-day reality of the camp, the impossible choices she faced, and the way she had absorbed punishment meant for others. When she mentioned the specific incident that left the scars on her ribs, he stood and turned toward the window, unable to maintain eye contact. "Sarah, why didn't you report this when you were debriefed?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "The people responsible should have faced justice for what they did to you." "Because I knew what would happen," Sarah replied. "I would become the woman who couldn't handle combat, the victim who needed special protection. My career would be defined by what was done to me rather than what I accomplished. The other prisoners survived because of the choices I made in that camp. I wasn't going to let their sacrifice be diminished by turning me into a symbol of female vulnerability." The Admiral struggled with the weight of what she was telling him. He had spent his career believing in the honor and integrity of military service, trusting that the system would protect those who served with distinction. Learning that one of his most promising officers had been failed so completely by that system challenged everything he thought he understood about leadership and responsibility. Sarah continued her account, describing how she had created support networks within the camp, how she had traded her own safety for the survival of others, and how each scar represented a conscious choice to shield her fellow prisoners from the worst treatments. She spoke of the psychological warfare employed by their captors, the way they tried to turn prisoners against each other, and how her resistance became a focal point for maintaining unit cohesion even in the darkest circumstances. "The scars aren't just marks of what was done to me," she explained. "They're evidence of what I chose to do for my fellow sailors. Every one of them represents a moment when I decided that their survival was worth my pain. I've worn them as private medals of honor for 3 years, but I'm tired of carrying this story alone." Admiral Hayes returned to his seat, visibly shaken by what he had heard. He had known Sarah was strong, but he was only now beginning to understand the true depth of her character and the price she had paid for her commitment to her fellow service members. The medal ceremony that morning suddenly felt inadequate, almost insulting in its failure to recognize the full measure of her sacrifice. "What do you need from me, Sarah?" he asked. "How can I help you carry this burden?" Sarah looked down at her hands, gathering courage for the hardest part of her request. "I want to tell the real story, Admiral. Not just to you, but officially. I want other service members who might face similar situations to know that survival is possible, that they can endure and still maintain their honor. But I also want the Navy to acknowledge that the sanitized version of events does a disservice to everyone who was in that camp." The implications of what she was proposing were enormous. Opening an official inquiry into her treatment would require revisiting classified operations, potentially embarrassing revelations about intelligence failures, and uncomfortable questions about why the full truth hadn't been reported earlier. It would also thrust Sarah into a spotlight that could destroy her privacy and define her legacy in ways she might not be able to control. Admiral Hayes studied her face, seeing determination mixed with vulnerability in equal measure. This was the same woman who had faced down impossible odds in a Japanese prison camp, who had sacrificed her own well-being for her fellow prisoners, and who was now choosing courage over comfort once again. The decision he made in the next few moments would determine not just Sarah's future, but the Navy's willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the cost of service. Admiral Hayes sat in silence for several long minutes, processing the weight of Sarah's revelation and the decision that lay before him. The office felt charged with tension as both of them understood that this conversation would change everything, not just for Sarah, but potentially for how the Navy handled similar situations in the future. "If we do this, Sarah, there's no going back," the Admiral finally said. "Once we open this door, you'll face scrutiny from investigators, journalists, and people who might question your motives for staying silent this long. Are you prepared for that kind of attention?" Sarah had been thinking about exactly this question for months. The decision to speak out hadn't come easily or suddenly. It had grown from a combination of factors: the nightmares that wouldn't stop, the isolation she felt even among fellow veterans who thought they understood her experience, and, most importantly, the letters she had received from other service members struggling with their own hidden traumas. "I've been getting letters from other sailors, both men and women, who went through experiences they felt they couldn't report," Sarah explained. "Some were prisoners of war, others faced different kinds of abuse from fellow service members or superiors. They reach out because they know my story, or at least the official version of it, and they're looking for someone who might understand what it's like to carry secrets that feel too dangerous to tell." She pulled a small stack of letters from her bag, placing them on the Admiral's desk. "These are just from the last 6 months. People who are suffering in silence because they're afraid of what speaking out might cost them. I realized that my silence isn't just about protecting my own career anymore. It's contributing to a culture where victims feel they have to choose between their truth and their service." Admiral Hayes picked up one of the letters, reading the careful handwriting of a young seaman who had been assaulted by a superior officer during shore leave. The sailor's words echoed themes that ran through all the correspondence: fear of retaliation, concern about being believed, and the crushing weight of carrying trauma alone while trying to maintain the appearance of military bearing. This sailor was told by his commanding officer that reporting the incident would destroy both his career and the career of the person who attacked him, Sarah continued. He was advised to handle it quietly and move on. But trauma doesn't work that way. You can't just decide to move on from something that fundamentally changed who you are. The Admiral's face grew darker as he read through more of the letters. Each one represented a failure of the system he had devoted his life to serving. The military's emphasis on strength and resilience, while necessary for combat effectiveness, had created an environment where admitting vulnerability felt like admitting failure. "I've been thinking about this for months," Sarah said. "If I tell my story publicly, completely and honestly, it might give other people permission to tell theirs. But, more than that, it might force the Navy to examine how we handle situations where our people are pushed beyond human limits and need support rather than silence." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Admiral Hayes called for whoever it was to enter, and Captain Maria Rodriguez stepped into the office. Sarah recognized her immediately. Rodriguez had been one of the few female officers to achieve command rank, and her reputation for protecting her sailors was legendary throughout the fleet. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Admiral, but I wanted to speak with Lieutenant Mitchell before she left," Captain Rodriguez said. "I heard about her commendation today, and I wanted to offer my congratulations personally." Sarah started to stand, but Rodriguez gestured for her to remain seated. "Actually, I was hoping we might all talk together. I've been following your career, Lieutenant, and I've noticed some things that concern me. Not about your performance, that's been exemplary, but about how you're carrying yourself. I recognize the signs because I've seen them in other sailors, and I've experienced them myself." The admission hung in the air like a challenge. Captain Rodriguez was known for her strength and no-nonsense approach to command. Hearing her acknowledge personal struggle was unexpected and powerful. Admiral Hayes looked between the two women, sensing that this conversation was taking on dimensions he hadn't anticipated. "What I'm about to say doesn't leave this office without permission from all of us," Rodriguez continued, settling into a chair. "But I think it might be relevant to whatever you two have been discussing. 5 years ago, during my deployment in the Mediterranean, I was sexually assaulted by a senior officer during what was supposed to be a routine briefing." Sarah felt her breath catch. Here was exactly what she had been talking about: another officer carrying a burden alone, maintaining perfect military bearing while dealing with trauma that the system wasn't equipped to address. "I never reported it because I knew it would end my career," Rodriguez continued. "Not officially, but practically. I would become the officer who couldn't handle herself around male colleagues. Every promotion, every assignment, every evaluation would be viewed through that lens. So I stayed quiet, did my job, and tried to pretend it never happened." Admiral Hayes looked stricken. Two of his most accomplished officers were revealing experiences that challenged everything he thought he knew about their service and his own leadership. "Maria, I wish you had felt you could come to me with this. With respect, Admiral, you're part of a system that makes it nearly impossible for people to report these incidents without destroying their careers, Rodriguez replied. It's not about your personal character or intentions. It's about institutional culture that prizes appearance over truth, that treats victims like problems to be managed rather than people to be supported. Sarah realized that this moment represented exactly what she had been hoping for, an honest conversation about the costs of military service that went beyond physical wounds and combat stress. Captain Rodriguez, have you been getting letters too? Dozens of them, Rodriguez confirmed. From sailors who know my reputation for taking care of my people. They're looking for someone in authority who might understand what they're going through. The problem is, I can offer them support and understanding, but I can't offer them a system that will protect them if they choose to speak out. The three officers sat in contemplative silence, each processing the magnitude of what was being discussed. Admiral Hayes was facing the realization that his Navy, the institution he loved and had served faithfully for decades, was failing some of its most dedicated personnel. Sarah was seeing confirmation that her own experience was part of a larger pattern of institutional blindness. Captain Rodriguez was finally giving voice to concerns she had carried alone for years. What if we changed that? Admiral Hayes asked quietly. What if we used this moment to begin addressing these systemic failures rather than continuing to manage them quietly? Sarah leaned forward, sensing an opportunity she hadn't dared to hope for. What would that look like, Admiral? It would start with an official review of your case, conducted with the goal of understanding not just what happened to you, but how our systems failed to protect and support you, he replied. But it would also include a broader examination of how we handle trauma, assault, and other experiences that our people currently feel they can't report safely. Captain Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. It would require creating new protocols for support that prioritize the victim's well-being over institutional embarrassment. It would mean training officers to recognize signs of unreported trauma and to respond with care rather than suspicion. The scope of what they were discussing was enormous. It would require challenging decades of military culture, confronting uncomfortable truths about institutional failures, and accepting that strength sometimes meant admitting vulnerability. But all three officers understood that the alternative, continuing to allow dedicated service members to suffer in silence, was unacceptable. If I do this, if I tell the complete truth about what happened in that camp, I need to know that it will serve a purpose beyond just my own healing, Sarah said. I need to know that other people won't have to make the choice between their truth and their career. Admiral Hayes made his decision with the same decisiveness that had marked his entire career. Lieutenant Mitchell, I believe your story needs to be told, and I believe our institution needs to hear it. If you're willing to trust me with this process, I'm willing to stake my career on making sure it results in real change rather than just official acknowledgement. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same ceremony hall where she had received her Navy Cross, but everything about this gathering was different. Today, she would address a special joint session of military leadership, congressional representatives, and advocates for veteran affairs. The room was filled with people who had come to hear not a celebration of heroism, but a reckoning with truth. Admiral Hayes had kept his promise. The official review of Sarah's case had been conducted with unprecedented transparency and thoroughness. The investigators had not only documented what happened to her in the Japanese prison camp, but had also examined why the full truth had been suppressed in the original reports and what systemic changes were needed to prevent similar failures in the future. The process had been more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. Reliving her experiences for investigators, medical professionals, and policy experts had reopened wounds she thought had healed. But it had also been liberating in ways she hadn't expected. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like she was being seen completely, not as a symbol or a problem to be managed, but as a whole person whose experiences mattered. Captain Rodriguez had become an unexpected ally and friend during the process. Together, they had worked with Admiral Hayes to develop new protocols for supporting service members who experienced trauma that fell outside traditional categories of combat stress. The framework they created emphasized healing over punishment, truth over appearance, and long-term wellness over short-term institutional comfort. The months of preparation had also brought unexpected connections. Sarah's decision to speak publicly had indeed given others permission to share their own stories. the letters that had once trickled in now arrived by the hundreds. More importantly, other officers had begun speaking out about their experiences, creating a community of survivors who supported each other through the difficult process of telling truths that had been hidden for years. As Sarah prepared to take the podium, she thought about the meeting with her mother that had happened just 2 weeks after her conversation with Admiral Hayes. Sitting in their family kitchen, she had finally told her mother everything about her captivity and its aftermath. The conversation had been painful but ultimately healing, strengthening a relationship that had been strained by years of careful omissions and half-truths. "I always knew you were carrying something too heavy for one person," her mother had said, holding Sarah close after hearing the full story. "I'm proud of you for surviving it, but I'm even more proud of you for choosing to share it so others don't have to suffer alone." Now, looking out at the assembled audience, Sarah saw faces that reflected the full spectrum of military service. There were officers who looked uncomfortable with the direction of the proceedings, clearly preferring the traditional approach of handling such matters quietly. But there were also faces that showed recognition and relief, people who had their own stories of hidden trauma and were grateful to see the institution finally confronting these issues directly. Admiral Hayes introduced Sarah with words that captured both her military achievements and her courage in bringing forward difficult truths. When she took the podium, the room fell completely silent. Everyone present understood that they were about to hear something that would challenge their understanding of military service and sacrifice. Sarah began by acknowledging the discomfort that many in the room probably felt about this gathering. Military culture teaches us that strength means enduring without complaint, that honor requires putting mission before personal concerns, and that admitting vulnerability is a sign of weakness, she said. "I believed those things when I entered the Navy, and I still believe in the importance of strength, honor, and mission focus. But I've learned that true strength sometimes means admitting when the system has failed us, and real honor requires telling the truth even when it's uncomfortable." She then told her story, beginning with her capture and moving through each stage of her imprisonment. But this time, she wasn't just recounting events, she was analyzing how military training, culture, and support systems had both helped and failed her during that ordeal. She spoke about the strength she drew from her identity as a Navy officer, but also about how that same identity had made it nearly impossible to seek help when she needed it most. When Sarah reached the part of her story about the scars on her ribs, she paused and made a decision that surprised even herself. "These scars have been hidden under my uniform for 3 years," she said. "They've been private reminders of choices I made to protect my fellow prisoners. But today, I want them to represent something more than personal survival. I want them to represent the wounds that all service members carry, seen and unseen, and our collective commitment to healing rather than hiding them." With steady hands, Sarah lifted her shirt to reveal the raised, crisscrossed scars across her ribs. The room remained silent, but the quality of that silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of polite attention, but the profound quiet of people confronting truths they had never fully acknowledged. Admiral Hayes felt tears in his eyes as he watched Sarah's demonstration of courage. In all his years of service, he had never seen anyone display such strength through vulnerability. The scars she revealed were indeed marks of honor, but they also represented every failure of the system to protect those who served it faithfully. As Sarah continued her presentation, she outlined the recommendations that had emerged from the official review. New protocols for supporting trauma survivors, enhanced training for leadership on recognizing signs of hidden distress, and, most importantly, cultural changes that would make seeking help a sign of strength rather than weakness. The proposals were comprehensive and ambitious, requiring significant changes to how the military approached personnel care. "The goal isn't to make military service easier," Sarah clarified. "The goal is to make it more honest. We ask extraordinary things of our service members, and sometimes those demands push people beyond normal human limits. When that happens, we need systems that support recovery and resilience rather than demanding silence and isolation." The questions that followed Sarah's presentation revealed the complexity of implementing such changes. Some officers worried about maintaining operational readiness if personnel were encouraged to report trauma and seek support. Others questioned whether creating new support systems might inadvertently encourage false reports or weaken military discipline. Sarah addressed each concern directly, drawing on her own experience and the research that had been conducted during the official review. The sailors who wrote to me weren't looking for ways to avoid duty or gain special treatment, she explained. They were desperate for ways to continue serving effectively while dealing with experiences that were affecting their performance and well-being. Supporting them isn't about lowering standards, it's about maintaining the human foundation that makes military excellence possible. The session concluded with Admiral Hayes announcing the implementation of the new protocols on a trial basis across several commands. The changes would be monitored and adjusted based on results, but the commitment to moving forward was clear. Sarah's courage in speaking out had created momentum for institutional change that might not have been possible otherwise. In the weeks that followed, Sarah received hundreds of letters from service members expressing gratitude for her decision to speak publicly. Many shared their own stories of hidden trauma and described how her example had given them hope that seeking help was possible without destroying their careers. The culture change she had hoped for was beginning to happen, one conversation at a time. 3 months after her presentation, Sarah received notification of her promotion to lieutenant commander, along with assignment to a new position developing training programs for military leadership on trauma-informed personnel support. The promotion felt different from previous advancements in her career. It was recognition not just of her service, but of her willingness to use her experience to benefit others. Admiral Hayes visited Sarah in her new office on her first day in the position. The space was filled with the letters she had received from fellow service members, as well as research materials and program development documents. On her desk sat a small framed photo from the ceremony where she had received her Navy Cross, next to another photo from the day she had spoken publicly about her experiences. "Any regrets about the path we chose?" the Admiral asked, settling into a chair across from her desk. Sarah looked out her window at the Naval Academy courtyard where her journey toward this moment had begun with a decision to tell the truth. "No regrets, Admiral. For the first time in 3 years, I feel like I'm wearing my uniform honestly. The scars are still there, but they're not secrets anymore. They're part of my service record, and they're helping other people write their own stories of survival and recovery." The scars on Sarah's ribs would always be there, permanent reminders of choices made in darkness and pain. But they were no longer symbols of hidden shame. They had become visible proof that strength could coexist with vulnerability, that honor could require admitting failure, and that true healing was possible when institutions were willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Sarah had lifted her shirt not just to reveal her wounds, but to begin the difficult work of healing wounds that extended far beyond her own experience.